Hello folks, welcome back. This is part 2 of Cooperative Breeders Are Not Always Cooperative. Today I'm going to talk specifically about the Pukeko in New Zealand. And this is a picture of the Pukeko. I introduced it yesterday a little bit. And as I mentioned, Pukeko are from New Zealand. And here's the much more trim and flight-capable Pukeko. This is the bird that we study in this park.
Ooh!
So, in part 2, this is an outline. This is what we're going to talk about in part 2. I'll talk a little bit about mating systems. I'm going to focus on mating systems in birds, but these mating systems apply to other species, other taxa as well. Then I'll talk about joint laying or nest sharing in Pukeko and smooth-billed anis. And then for the rest of it, I will focus on the Pukeko, and we'll talk about the mating system, indirect fitness, status signaling, and egg-laying control in these birds. You'll remember earlier we spoke about helpers at the nest, and under the conditions that the Florida scrub jay were in, if you were to stay home, you'd be staying home with mom and dad because they were a monogamous pair and they mated together, and therefore the young that they produced were your brothers and sisters, so that as long as you were there staying home, it would be helpful for you to stay and take care of your brothers and sisters. This is called monogamy, this idea that you have a mated pair. And in this case, here we see smooth-billed anis, and you'll see that there are a couple of pairs that are sticking close together. These are socially monogamous pairs. They joined these groups as pairs of birds, and they behave as pairs of birds. Every once in a while, they cheat on their mates. So they don't always, their young are not always full siblings for each other because there's a certain amount of cheating going on in these monogamous systems. But some species, like mute swans, and here you've probably seen pictures like this where the classic heart is formed by the two mute swans. This is a pair of mute swans, and they tend to be monogamous, and they tend to stay with the same mate throughout their lifetime unless he or she is killed.
Interesting.
So that's monogamy, a pair of birds that are at least socially exclusive to each other. They function as a pair. Polygyny is another system. It's a different system in which certain males may mate with many females. In this case, you see polygyny, a male hierarchy, a lekking system where males are out on fields. These particular prairie chickens or sage grouse, there are a number of different species that behave this way. These are actually sage grouse in this picture, and you'll see one of them with two females nearby, and the females will come to these leks. These are areas where the males all gather and they do strut their stuff. They do their displaying, and the females will come through, and they'll either pick a spot that they think probably holds the best male because he's able to defend that hot spot, or they'll pick a male that they find particularly attractive. And so this one male in this picture, the bottom picture, has two different females that are looking to mate with him. Here's the silverback male gorilla that has a bunch of females that live with him, and this is another harem situation. This is polygyny, where one male mates with several females. So that's one type, or that's another type beyond monogamy. Polyandry is quite a rare form, a rare mating system, and in polyandrous systems, a female has several male mates, and in this case, the male mates will do all of the incubation and early care of the offspring. So in this case, usually when we see birds, we come to expect the males to be very beautiful, and usually the males are bigger and they're much more beautiful. And in this case, this is a pair of phalaropes, and these phalaropes have a reverse size dimorphism and reverse plumage dimorphism, where the dull individual in the foreground is actually the male, and the female is brighter, trying to look sexy to attract males to take her eggs. And also she's bigger so that she can fight with other females. So the females actually try to find a mate. They'll fight for access to a mate. So this is the reverse, effectively, of polygyny. And here are the mating systems in birds, just as a reminder. So you'd have the monogamous system, and they show a swan here. In fact, they show a mute swan here, where you've got a male and a female paired together, and they do not have extra pair copulations. They don't cheat on their partner. Other socially monogamous pairs will sometimes have a main partner. So to the right, you see the example of chaffinches, and this is like the smooth-billed anis, where there will be a male that's partnered with one female, but once in a while, they might mate with another female. So that's monogamy, where social monogamy to your right and actual genetic monogamy as well to your left. Polygyny, again, it shows a lek, in this case with a grouse, or a capercaillie, which is a type of grouse, where the females all prefer a particular male. So one male is mating with many females. There are often more than one male that get to mate with many females, but some males don't get to mate at all. Or you can have a harem, much like the gorilla that we saw with the silverback male that had several females. And then to the right is polyandry, where females defend large territories and they mate with several different males. So the female mating with several males. So those are 4 different mating systems, and there's still a 5th one, and that's called polygynandry. And polygynandry, you might recognize, is a combination of polygyny and polyandry. That means, and the example here are Pukeko. And in the Pukeko society, males will mate with several females, and females will mate with several males. So all of the breeding males and females within a group of Pukeko will mate with each other, and they don't have pair bonds. The second section then of this part 2 in the outline, we're going to talk about joint laying or nest sharing in Pukeko and smooth-billed anis. This is a very short section. So joint laying is a very rare system of where multiple females lay eggs in a single nest. And here you see on the left a smooth-billed ani nest with lots of these eggs that look virtually identical in the smooth-billed ani, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But these eggs were laid by more than one female. In fact, up to 7 females could lay eggs in a single smooth-billed ani nest. Now to the right you see a fairly typical Pukeko nest, and in this nest there are 7 eggs, 3 of which were laid by one female, 4 of which were laid by another female. Quite distinctive patterns on these eggs. So unlike the smooth-billed anis, the female Pukeko lay eggs that look quite different from each other. The third part of this outline is the Pukeko mating system, indirect fitness, status signaling, and egg-laying control. And this is where I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the system of the Pukeko. So here's an image of our friend the Pukeko. It's a communally breeding and joint-laying bird. Communally breeding meaning that they live together in a group and they share in the care and the breeding. As I mentioned before, they're often polygynandrous. Every once in a while you might get a pair of them living together. They're natally philopatric groups with a linear dominance hierarchy. Now that's a big mouthful, and what that means is that when a Pukeko is hatched in a nest, particularly in the North Island of New Zealand where we study them, that animal will grow up and will tend to stay on that territory. It will eventually become a breeder on the territory, which is quite strange because that means that quite often in these families of Pukeko, the young become breeders and therefore they end up mating with their siblings or with their parents. And this is something that's very common in these birds. So in one study, 75% of all of the copulations that were seen were between siblings or between offspring and their parents. So first degree inbreeding. These birds are widespread throughout New Zealand, and there are differences between populations. The one that we study in the north have year-round kin groups, and they have non-breeding helpers. So some of the males and some of the females in these groups, while being adults, they are helpers. They perform much as the Florida scrubjay helper at the nest perform. They have a place, they stay home, and they know that some of the offspring, many of the offspring, are closely related to them, and so staying home and helping raise those young tends to favor the propagation of these genes for this helping behavior. In the south, they are seasonal groups. They don't hold territories throughout the season, and they have no helpers. And that's something that we're studying, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail in this presentation. So here we see New Zealand, and there's the spot, the yellow spot that just appeared. That's where we work on them on the North Island. We have done some work also in the South Island. We saw images of the beautiful mute swans, and this is just a slide to indicate to you that in most birds, males will fight over females. So one male might be intruding on the other male's mate, and he's not going to put up with it. So he's putting on a big fight. He's going to drive away the intruder so that the intruder can't mate with his partner. Now this is a video, and it's a video of Pukeko. The one to the right, the small one, is a female Pukeko, and the one that's approaching it is a male. The male is interested in mating with that female, and you're going to see what I refer to as a copulation run. These birds do this, and it's not an aggressive chase. These are 2 males following the female, and the female is leading them on a little copulation run. So the 2 males are interested in mating with this female. Sorry for the wind noise. That's just the way it is. And so they're running along, hoping. And in this case, this is a censored video, so you don't get to see what happens after this. However, if you did get to see, if you followed up on it, this is what you would tend to see: is the successful male on top is going to mate with this female, and the other male, and it doesn't matter whether the other male is bigger or more dominant, he will just watch this happen. He doesn't fight. They don't fight. And the reason they don't fight is because these groups of Pukeko, actually it's the males that defend the territory. And so the dominant male is quite permissive of having other males join the group. Often they're his own relatives, because the males will defend the territory. So if you have other males that are going to help defend the territory, they have to earn something. They have to earn a living, and they don't earn money. What they earn is fitness. They earn the ability to copulate with females and to produce copies of their genes in the way of their offspring. So once again, here's a nest of Pukeko. We can distinguish the eggs quite clearly. Here's another nest. In this case, there are 5 laid by one female and 4 laid by another. And this causes some problems. And one of those problems you can see in this image, and that is that there's a crack in this egg. When you get too many eggs laid in a nest, often the eggs will break and they will fail to hatch. And so we've been studying for quite some time, trying to ask why it is that females, dominant females, that is the ones that are in charge of the group, why don't they prevent all females from laying eggs in the nest? Why don't they just not allow the subordinate females to lay any eggs in the nest? Because if they would only lay their own eggs, then there would be less egg breakage, and all of the group members would be taking care of only that female's offspring. So her offspring would get great care. Well, it turns out that the female dominant bird in a group tends to lay earlier, and chicks from earlier laid eggs tended to grow larger in the first 60 days. So if you're hatching out earlier, you tend to grow faster. They survived better over a period of time. And here we see a graph to the right that shows those that survived versus those that didn't survive as a function of their hatching order. So what you see is the first 2 that hatched, their frequency of surviving offspring is very high. The number that did not survive is much lower than the number that did survive, and the number that did survive is much higher than the comparable individuals that were hatched 3rd or 4th or 5th. Once you're beyond the 4th to hatch, it looks like your chances of surviving are very, very slim. So the dominant lays earlier, the young survive better, and a year later, when these birds stayed on, the young stayed on the same territory and grew up, they were ranked higher. So within the same clutch of eggs, you could hatch just a couple of days before another individual, and your status, your dominant status, your ranking in the group would be higher in the next year. So these are all reasons that the dominant can go ahead and allow other females to lay eggs.
Ooh.
As well, these dominant females gained indirect fitness benefits because of the high kinship in these groups. So you'll remember that indirect fitness is when you're caring for offspring that aren't necessarily your own. If they're relatives of yours, they may share the genes that cause you to do this behavior. And so this is called indirect fitness. Dominance, however, matters. Subordinates lay fewer eggs, and helpers do not lay any eggs. And so dominance becomes an issue in Pukeko. So we're asking the question here, how is dominance maintained in groups? And this allows me to introduce Cody Day, who is a PhD student of mine, and he worked in New Zealand. Here he is sitting on a hillside in Tafernui Park with a telescope. And he studied this question. He asked the question, what signals might there be that allow these birds to keep track of who's in charge? And he focused his efforts on, you can see this insert, this is the skull of a Pukeko. And if you look on the forehead, there's this fleshy shield. We call it a shield. It's a bright red, it's very much like the wattles of a chicken. It's fleshy, and it may act as a signal of dominance. And the reason we think this in part is because they show their shields to each other when they're engaged in aggressive interaction. They will look down like this and show the shield to the other partner. Now this is an image showing a trap. This is how we catch them quite often. So this trap has been baited with corn, and these animals will go in through a little tunnel, a little hole in the side of the trap that has a wire forming a tunnel, and they get inside the trap. And when you come up to try to catch them, and here's Diane coming to catch these birds, they can't get out that hole because they can't find the opening. So we can catch them, and then we can do various measurements. And one of the things that we noticed over time was that there's an enormous difference, a lot of variation in the shield size. So if you look at the top one, it has a very small shield, and the bottom one has a much larger shield. And these, as I mentioned, these are displayed during interactions. These shields, they show each other their shields. And they can, in fact, change size over days because they are heavily vascularized. There's blood vessels there and innervated, so there are nerves going through the shield. Now this is a little video that will show you one of the ways when we try to study these birds, we watch their behaviors and we watch interactions and we identify who's dominant to whom. And what you see here is a stake in the middle of the picture, and there is corn. We will put a little pile of corn there, and then we'll watch what happens. And you'll watch for behavior. You'll see that there are behaviors, and you should be able to tell that some birds are being more aggressive and others are being more submissive in these interactions. And you'll notice the songs in the background. See how they show each other's shield? The beautiful sound in the background, that was not the Pukeko. The Pukeko just shriek. They give all kinds of loud and obnoxious sounds. You heard bellbirds singing in the background there. Now, when we watch these birds, we'll watch them for several interactions. We'll watch them for half-hour periods a number of times, and we can, as a result of that, we can generate what are called David scores. Now, I'm hoping you should be able to see this arrow. So the y-axis here is called the David score, and the higher the value of the David score, that means the more dominant individuals have very high values. And so the y-axis shows David score. The x-axis down here shows shield width. That is, from one side to the other, that width is what you're looking at for this shield width. And each of these squares, each of these boxes, except for this one, represent individual groups. And what you'll notice in these groups is there's a tendency for a correlation where the higher your dominance score, the higher your width of your shield generally. Now, we've taken all of these points and put them onto one box just so you can see that trend. So if you have a wide shield, you will also tend to be a dominant bird. Now, we've done analyses of this, and we know, for instance, that this is true even if you take into account the body size. So two birds with the same body size, one with a very wide shield and the other with a more narrow shield, the one with the wider shield will tend to be the dominant one. So in order to show that this was actually involved in the signaling, we did an experiment where we made the shields of some birds look smaller. And you can see here, this bird has a shield that's painted black. This black is intended to match the feathers behind so that it looks like it has a very small shield. Now this is like, there's a card game, and I forget what it's called, but it involves having a card stuck on you have to hold it on your forehead or something so everyone else can see your card and you can't see your card. And I'm not much of a game player, but the bottom line is that you're marching around not knowing what your card says. In the case of this poor Pukeko, he's marching around thinking he's really a tough guy, but his signal that he's sending out, at least this is what we're presuming when we set up this experiment, is saying, hey, I'm just a little wimp because I have a tiny shield. So we had controls, which are a control in an experiment is another treatment that allows us to make sure it's not the paint, just the feeling or the paint on the shield that causes the problems. Rather, it's the appearance of the shield. And so here we see the control. And so the control, it's hard to see, but it has actually been painted with a color that matches the shield. So that shouldn't have an effect, but it allows us to make comparisons. So we would look at the dominance and the interactions before and after the birds were painted. And we would look at how they were treated by the other birds. And so here what we see is on the y-axis differences in dominance interactions. So whether they challenged more often, so challenging here on the x-axis, the number of challenges or the number of attacks. So the challenges are signals that say, I'm aggressive towards you. What are you going to do about it? And the attacks are actually physical attacks. And you see the red dots reflect the actual controls, the ones that were not, that didn't have their shield painted so that it looked smaller. And the ones that had reduced shields are up here. And what you can see is there were more challenges aimed at the individuals that looked like they had small shields, but they didn't know that. And there were more attacks on those individuals. So there were socially there were consequences of this change in their appearance. So they seemed to be paying attention to the nature, to the size of the shield. And what was even more amazing was that after a week we tried to catch them, and then we remeasured their shields. And when we remeasured their shields, their actual shield size now, not just the appearance of it, it turned out that here are the controls. The controls were about the same size as before and after the treatment. But the males that had their shields reduced, they changed in size. They shrank. They physically shrank. They became smaller. We presume it's because of a hormonal shift, because the other birds were treating them as though they were lower ranked and were attacking them more often, and effectively, in more anthropological terms than we usually use, they kind of lost their confidence, and in losing their confidence, probably their androgens, some hormones in their bloodstream, decreased, and this translated into a shrinkage of the actual shield.
Interesting.
So this is an interesting case, because you can't make yourself have a great big shield and then march around and expect people to respect you, because they may challenge you. And if they challenge you, that's going to have, it turns out, a physiological feedback. So the way this works is individual quality. If you're of high quality, you would produce a shield that is large. That shield size is your signal. That signal will affect the social environment, but in reverse, the social environment will affect the signal. So if you're picked on a lot, it will cause that signal to shrink. So this keeps this signal honest in a sense. So if you're of high enough quality to maintain your signal, everything's fine. Everyone will appreciate that you're high quality and you're a dominant individual, and they won't challenge you. However, if you can't back it up, you might be challenged, and eventually your signal, your shield will shrink. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you will stay tuned for the next episode on the smooth-billed Anis. I'd like to thank Ian Jameson and acknowledge him. Ian was a very good friend of mine. Ian was the person that got me interested in Pukeko in the first place. He was a Canadian biologist who moved to New Zealand, and he died much too young of a brain tumor fairly recently, and it was a very sad loss. So this is for Ian. Other acknowledgements: Dr. Cody Day, Blaine Lansborough, Diane Fields, my partner. Field assistants, we have a number of field assistants. Collaborators: Ian Jameson, who I just mentioned, Dr. James Dale at Massey University, Dr. Diane Brunton, Massey University, Crystal Kane, Auckland University, and Dr. Sigal Balshine at McMaster. And all of the park rangers and people that work at Tafranui Regional Park, and the volunteers known as TASI, the Tafranui Open Sanctuary. Anyway, those folks are the volunteers, and I thank them as well.